Buenas noches. Vamos a dar inicio a la conferencia magistral del día de hoy. Tengo el gusto de estar aquí en la mesa con el profesor Thomas Nenon de la Universidad de Memphis. Estamos conversando fuera la tercera vez, cuarta o quinta vez que viene a Perú a diversas actividades de filosofía, del CIFER, de CLAFEM, del Círculo Fenomenológico. So welcome here again. It's a pleasure for us to have you here. El profesor Thomas Nenon es profesor de filosofía y vicerrector de evaluación, investigación institucional e informes en la Universidad de Memphis. Me cuenta que acaba de jubilarse en mayo de este año y está contento. Obtuvo su doctorado en la Universidad de Friburgo y trabajó como instructor en esta misma universidad y como editor en los archivos Husserl. Sus áreas de interés a lo largo de los años incluyen a Husserl, Heidegger, Kant y el idealismo alemán, hermenéutica y filosofía de las ciencias sociales. Ha sido coeditor junto con Hans Reiner Sepp de los volúmenes 25 y 27 de la Husserliana, así como editor de reseñas para Husserl Studies, miembro del comité ejecutivo de la Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy, director del Centro de Humanidades y presidente del Centro para Investigación Avanzada en la Fenomenología. Sus intereses actuales de investigación son las teorías de Husserl sobre la personalidad y la subjetividad y la filosofía práctica de Kant y Hegel. Sus publicaciones incluyen, lo voy a decir en castellano, Objetividad y Conocimiento Finito, la teoría de la correspondencia en la filosofía trascendental de Kant. También ha coeditado libros como Las ideas de Husserl con Lester Embry, que también ha estado acá, si no me equivoco, y Advancing Phenomenology, avanzando la fenomenología, desarrollando la fenomenología, ensayos en honor a Lester Embry en el año 2010. Entonces dejo con ustedes al profesor Thomas Nenon, que nos va a hablar sobre la relevancia de la interpretación heideggeriana del esquematismo en la filosofía trascendental de Kant. El profesor Nenon va a leer en inglés, van a tener ustedes ahí la traducción en castellano en pantalla, y luego las preguntas las pueden hacer en inglés o en castellano y las traduzco yo, y si tengo algún problema me ayudará Rosemary para que ustedes se sientan más cómodos. ¿Sí? Gracias, profesor Nenon, por favor.
Thank you, Professor Patrón. I want to begin by thanking Rosemary and the Philosophical Institute here at the Pontifical for the honor and the pleasure of the invitation to be here again in your beautiful country with such warm people. I've enjoyed the conference and learned and followed the papers that I've been able to attend over the last couple of days. So this has been a wonderful experience for me. Thank you very much. I apologize that I cannot speak Spanish, and I will try not to read too fast, and I hope those of you, it might help that we have a translation available. Martin Heidegger's extensive treatment of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in his Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics book from 1929 has had very little impact on mainline Kant scholarship up until now. This is both unfortunate and understandable. It's understandable because Heidegger's interpretations of key passages and doctrines from the first critique in the second half of part 2 and in part 3 of that book is sandwiched in between Heidegger's reflection on how the critique fits into an overall history of the grounding of metaphysics in the first part and the beginning of the second, reflections that require familiarity with Heidegger's comprehensive and unique reading of the history of philosophy as developed and laid out in his early lecture courses, and his very general introduction to the basic philosophical positions and insights as presented in Being and Time. Moreover, his Kant book employs much of the unique terminology Heidegger had developed in his early work, and thus requires a reader who is already initiated into that language or willing to undertake the significant efforts of working one's way into it, at least enough to follow Heidegger's interpretations in this work. It's unfortunate because Heidegger's original reading is in many areas compelling and illuminating, shedding new light, not just on Kant's text, but on the important issues it addresses. In this paper, I will concentrate on just a few of these insights that I consider among the most important. These include his position on the relationship between appearances and things in themselves, the incompleteness of Kant's transcendental deduction of the categories, how temporality and what Kant calls the imagination are related, and how a more dynamic understanding of temporality than the way it is introduced in the transcendental aesthetic is critical to an appropriate understanding of how temporality is fundamental to Kant's entire project. At the heart of all these issues, Heidegger claims, is that the all too often neglected second book of the Transcendental Analytic, which Heidegger says should have constituted a separate third division in addition to the Transcendental Aesthetics and the Transcendental Analytic, on schematism and the principles or Grundsätze. Regarding the schematism, Heidegger in fact claims that, quote, these 11 pages of the Critique of Pure Reason have to constitute the core section of the entire voluminous work, end of quote. In what follows, I will lay out Heidegger's arguments for these claims and suggest that each of them is well-founded, both as interpretations of Kant and as genuine phenomenological insights, which is why I think it is unfortunate that the section on schematism and the principles continue to be unjustly neglected in most mainstream Kant scholarship. In the Kant book, many of these points are made briefly and as mentioned above in a terminology that is assumed by Heidegger rather than explained in that book. However, Heidegger's 1927-28 lecture course, Phenomenological Interpretation of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, is now also available as a resource to understand and explain the interpretations of Kant presented in the 1929 book. The lectures are approximately 3 times longer, allowing Heidegger much more room to develop his thoughts more fully, but also with concrete examples and using a much less technical vocabulary that make them much more accessible to the common reader. Tellingly, he also notes in the very last pages of the lecture course that his reading was decisively informed by his understanding of key insights gleaned from Husserl's phenomenology. Summarizing the overall conclusion of his interpretation in the lecture course, quote, that schematism points to the originary sphere for the radical foundation of the possibility of ontological knowledge, end of quote. He explains that, again, quote, in studying the Critique of Pure Reason a few years ago, I read it against the background of Husserl's phenomenology. It fell like scales from my eyes, and Kant became an essential confirmation of the correctness of the pathway in which I was searching, end of quote. Hence, this talk will undertake to explain the most important contributions from the Kant book, including his core claim that the schematism chapter is the key to the entire Kantian critical project, at least in theoretical reason, using the book itself and the lecture course in which this thesis was developed, along with references to Husserl's phenomenological insights that I believe are the ones that Heidegger is referring to in this passage. Heidegger begins by describing how Kant's metaphysical project initially centers around the question of whether and how humans can know something about beings, which are viewed back towards the Metaphysica Specialis of the Wolf-Baumgarten school of philosophy that claim to provide pure rational knowledge of transcendent objects like the cosmos as a whole, the human soul, and God. But first addresses the question concerning, quote, the inner possibility of a general making manifest, offenbar machen, of beings as such, end of quote. According to Kant's own account, instead of assuming the possibility of knowing such transcendent objects, Kant takes his first clues from the success of modern natural science and asks whether it is not possible to identify a priori conditions for the possibility of recognizing nature and natural objects. He also notes that modern natural science is built around certain laws and principles that it uses to pose specific questions to the natural phenomena it investigates. We heard a little bit about that in the recent paper. He also notes that modern science, analogously then, Kant proposes to seek out the a priori or transcendental conditions for the empirical knowledge of objects, or in Heidegger's language, quote, the advanced understanding of the basic constitution of being, Seinsverfassung, ontological knowledge, that makes possible the ontic or empirical knowledge of specific entities. Hence, Heidegger's claim that Kant's project should be understood not just as an epistemology, as the Marburg neo-Kantians claimed, but as a metaphysical investigation into the basic structures that ground the being of the beings at issue in the first place, as a fundamental ontology. Since being manifests itself in an understanding in advance of the basic structures of those beings as an a priori understanding, it is also a critique of pure reason, or using some other terms that will become important later in this talk, quote, ontic knowledge can only correspond to beings, objects, or Gegenstände, if these beings, Seiendes, as beings are already apparent, known with regard to the basic constitution of their being, Seinsverfassung. The manifestness of beings, ontic truth, centers around the unveiledness, Enthülltheit, of the basic constitution of the being of beings, ontological truth. End of the quote. Heidegger thereby establishes parallels between his own project of fundamental ontology as an investigation of the being of beings as such, and Kant's critical project. But what are the beings that Kant takes to be the prime examples of the objects of such empirical knowledge? For finite knowers, they are not the things that the Wolf-Baumgarten school claimed to be able to know through pure reason, that is, transcendent non-natural beings, but rather they are the things that show themselves to us in intuitions, the appearances, Erscheinungen. Heidegger clarifies further that, quote, the title appearance refers to an entity itself as the object of finite knowledge, end of quote, rejecting the neo-Kantian, and not just neo-Kantian claim, the very still widespread belief in standard Kant scholarship. Excuse me, I lost my place. Okay, here we go. That behind the mere appearances are somehow the true objects of knowledge, namely the things in themselves. As Heidegger clearly lays out in the lecture course, again, I quote Heidegger, appearances are not mere semblance, shine. They are also not merely some kind of disconnected things beside or prior to the things in themselves, but rather the very encountered things themselves, just as they are present in the realm of the world that we discover. What is not open to us, those are the things themselves in as far as they are the objects of absolute knowing, that is, an intuition that needs no projected backdrop and does not have to wait for their affecting us and does not just allow them to be encountered, but rather makes them become what they are through this intuition. Continuing the quote, the difference between a thing in itself and an appearance refers to the things themselves, but under the heading of appearance, the things as they are encountered in finite intuition. Under the heading of thing in itself, the very same thing as they arise from an infinite intuition, that is, from one that brings them forth in the first place, that is, a divine being. Here, end of the quote. Here, Husserl's historically informed perspective on this issue is particularly helpful because he correctly identifies the proper location of the distinction in the theological discussion about the differences between finite and divine knowledge. It is not the same as the discussion about the genuine or supposedly truly objective properties of objects in the sense of primary versus secondary properties as discussed by Galileo or Locke, even though something like that is how the neo-Kantians and most others have read him, including most recently the so-called new realists like Quentin Malissou. In the lecture course, Heidegger addresses the issue directly, when Kant speaks of the indeterminate object of an empirical intuition, he was referring not to the, quote, theoretical, scientifically recognized object, end quote, but rather to the things that are encountered in pre-scientific experiential knowing. Kant himself makes, and this is often overlooked, that distinguishes between appearances and things in themselves in an empirical sense, in the sense of the pre-scientific versus modern scientific determinations of objects, and the distinction between appearances and things in themselves, not in a metaphysical sense, but as he says, in an empirical sense. So, for instance, one can describe a rainbow in terms of how it looks to us, or in terms of the physical phenomena that give rise to it, light shining through water particles. But even those water particles, or very abstract things like a magnetic force field, are not things in themselves in a metaphysical sense, since they exist, if they do exist, in space and time, and we know about them, if not through direct intuitions, then based on causal inferences that can ultimately be traced back to some direct experiences or intuitions. These appearances are what Husserl labeled as Dinge, things, spatio-temporally located objects that are causally determined and present themselves to us directly or indirectly through sense perceptions. In the first section of the Ideas 2, and in Husserl's Phenomenology and the Crisis of European Humanity, he describes how they come to be constituted from the objects presented to us in everyday perception to the kinds of objects described in natural science. In both cases, however, to constitute mere things instead of everyday objects, we deal with as use objects or culturally determined objects. The first step, as Husserl describes it in the introductory paragraphs of the Ideas 2, is to abstract from their evaluative, practical, and cultural predicates and concentrate simply on them as, quote, theoretical objects. One of Husserl's main criticisms of Kant that Heidegger is going to agree with, but not emphasize in the book, is that the fact that Kant neglects the richness of our daily experience and the way that objects in the personalistic attitude in which we normally conduct ourselves may be founded upon theoretical predicates, but are not reducible to them or normally classified and viewed primarily in terms of their strictly physical traits. Similarly, from the standpoint of being in time, a fair critique would be that Kant still views objects almost exclusively in terms of their Vorhandenheit, rather than focus on their Zuhandenheit that guides our everyday understanding of their being as equipment, Zeug. But in the Kant book and in the lectures, Heidegger's positive reading of Kant does not raise this issue, but simply concentrates on Kant's analysis of the necessary elements for the constitution of objects as vorhanden, or as things, to use Husserl's term. The fact that what is presented to us in experience, according to Heidegger's reading of Husserl, are the things themselves, not things in themselves, follows Husserl analysis of the relationship between what he calls intentional objects in the logical investigations, or noemata in the Ideas 1 on the one hand, and actual objects, the objects themselves when given in acts that count as the fulfillment of those intentions on the other. In the introduction to the sixth logical investigation, Husserl turns to the question of, quote, the relationship between meaning intentions and meaning fulfillment, or in traditional but admittedly equivocal ways of expressing it, the relationship between the concept or thought, understood here as the intuitively unfilled intention, and its corresponding intention, end of the quote. Husserl thereby reframes the traditional question of the relationship between thinking and being, representation and the object, not in terms of something that is, on the one hand, inescapably subjective, to an object that is not only independent, but inherently inaccessible to subjectivity, on the other, in completely new terms, namely as the question between empty and fulfilled intentions and the experience of self-givenness of the object in the appropriate kinds of intuition, evidence that can confirm that the object itself is indeed as intended, that is, the fulfillment of those intentions, or their disconfirmation. As Husserl says a little later, quote, the talk of knowing an object and fulfillment of the meaning intention express the same thing, just seen from different standpoints. End of that quote. For Husserl, this can include a whole range of different regions or basic kinds of objects, each with its own basic set of predicates that apply to them, he calls those categories, and each with its own specific kind of appropriate fulfilling intuitions. Hence, a key part of the phenomenological project is to elucidate these prior understandings of different kinds of objects, or as he calls them, regions of beings, what in Husserlian terms can be called the material a priori for each of these beings, corresponding fairly closely to what Heidegger is calling their ontological structure, Seinsverfassung, and their correlative guiding understanding of being, Seinsverständnis. The language Husserl uses for the same issue at the beginning of the fourth section of the Ideas 2 is, Ideas 1, that should be the Ideas 1. My mistake, is closer to the language you find in Heidegger's Kant book. As Husserl says, quote again, as a matter of principle in the logical sphere, the sphere of statements, being truly or being actually and reasonably being able to be confirmed, vernünftig ausweisbar sein, stand in correlation to one another. If we ask wherein rational confirmation or rational consciousness of a positive sense or state of affairs from the objective perspective, or a positive proposition from the correlative subjective perspective consist, the answer lies in the fact that it is the achievement of insight, again, evidence, or originarily giving consciousness, originärgebendes Bewusstsein, firsthand experience, we might say, and this, in turn, is connected with the notion of fulfillment. Another quote from Husserl, the distinction has to do with the way the sense, or rather a proposition, is a fulfilled or an unfulfilled sense or proposition. The equivalent term used by Heidegger in the Kant book for this experience of an object showing itself in experience through intuition is being encountered, begegnet werden, corresponding closely to what he calls in time, being discovered, entdeckt sein. This then brings us to the question of the critical role played by the schematism and the transcendental principles regarding the deduction of the categories. The transcendental deduction of the categories is the most thoroughly discussed section of the entire critique in standard Kant scholarship. Since Kant identifies two primary sources of knowledge, namely intuition and thinking, that are each necessary for knowledge, the common assumption is that the transcendental aesthetic, in which the a priori forms of intuition are presented and defended, and the transcendental deduction of the categories, in which the forms of thinking are presented and defended, are together represent the sections in which Kant presents his positive account of the elements that together are not only necessary, but also sufficient for an account of the experience of objects. The general justification for each of these two stems of knowledge of experience that are each a necessary condition for us to be able to know, Heidegger says, encounter, begegnen, the empirical objects of experience. What Kant calls their transcendental, that is, a priori truth, consists in the fact that, quote, the very famous quote, the conditions for the possibility of experience in general are at the same time conditions for the possibility of the objects of experience, and thus have objective validity in a synthetic judgment a priori. End of that quote. This is what the transcendental deductions of both the a priori forms of intuition and the categories are meant to have shown. But what about their application? And how is this related to the question of their justification? According to the standard reading, the categorical synthesis takes the material provided by intuition, both its a priori elements of space and time, and the manifold material provided through sensibility and sense intuition, and processes it in thinking to produce experience. Synthesizes is another word for the same thing. But what provides the assurance that the subjective application of the categories to the material provided by intuition is consistent with how the objects themselves really are? If we have access to the objects only through experience, and if experience involves subjective processes of synthesizing the material provided by intuition, which are in each case underdetermined, then doesn't that mean that we only have access to subjectively constituted objects that may or may not conform to the way the objects themselves really are? In other words, how do we know that our subjectively constituted objects actually conform with or correspond to the objects themselves? Kant is still, I argue, maintaining a correspondence theory of truth. So how do we know that they actually correspond? Based strictly on the transcendental aesthetic and the deduction of the categories, I would argue, and in fact, in my first book, I did argue that we do not. This is why many commentators have attempted to read Kant as suggesting a coherence theory or even a consensus theory of truth, since, according to that reading, we never have direct access to the objects themselves except as mediated through our own cognitive processes. Others, still oriented on some version of a coherent correspondence theory of truth, generally find the deductions lacking, since the necessity of the a priori elements of experience does not in itself provide any assurances that the experience objects constituted through synthesis truly correspond to the objects themselves. And that gives rise to some of this appearance versus thing in themselves in another way. On this point, Heidegger agrees and maintains that Kant himself general deductions with the section on the principles and the schematism precisely as an analytic of judgment, Urteilskraft, as the third element that together with intuition and the understanding is required for the transcendental logic to be complete. As Kant himself notes, quote, understanding and judgment both have their canon of objectively valid, hence true application in the transcendental logic, and so belong in the analytic section. The analytic of the principles, accordingly, is a canon for judgment that guides it in how the concepts of the understanding that contain the conditions for rules a priori are to be applied, end of quote. Without such guidance, the deduction of the categories is incomplete, according to Kant himself, since, quote, it, that is transcendental philosophy, must at the same time lay out the conditions under which objects can be brought into conformity with those concepts in terms of universal, but also sufficient terms, without which they would lack any content and thus be mere logical forms and not concepts of understanding, end of that quote. What the analytic of judgment shows is that the principles for the application of the concepts of the understanding are all related to temporality, so that temporality is a form of intuition provides not just the raw material for the categories, but also the standards for their concrete and correct application. Moreover, the very notion of temporality, as described in this section, becomes much richer and more dynamic than in the transcendental aesthetic. I'll begin by introducing some of these modifications using Kant's own terms, then turn to how Heidegger explains and expands them using his own terminology in the lectures and the Kant book. I will also address the issue of how Kant introduces, under the title of a transcendental doctrine of judgment, he ends up showing how establishing the intimate relationship between temporality and imagination is critical. The first important observation is that in the chapter on schematism and the principles, Kant speaks of time as an a priori form that not only makes possible, ermöglicht, but also restricts restingiert, the way that the categories are employed to bring about the experience of objects. We'll come back to that point below. Secondly, though, it's important to note that time and temporality as imposed in the schematism chapter are not simply formal determinations, but what one might call the filled or materially determinate order in which specific empirical sense impressions are located. Towards the beginning of the chapter, Kant explains how temporality can serve as a mediator between sensibility and the pure forms of thinking. I think this is my last longer quote. The concepts of the understanding, this is from Kant, each contain a pure synthetic unity of the manifold in general. Time is the formal condition for the manifold of the inner sense, hence the conjunction of all representation contains a manifold a priori and pure intuition. Now, the transcendental temporal determination is congruent with the category in as far as it is universal and based upon an a priori rule. It is, on the other hand, congruent with the appearance in as far as time is concerned in each empirical representation of the manifold. Hence, the application of the category to appearances is possible due to the transcendental determination of time, which, as the schema of the concepts of understanding, mediates the subsumption under the latter under the former. End of quote. This passage is commonly cited among those very few traditional scholars who do take the schematism seriously. Generally overlooked, however, is the significance of the subordinate clause, quote, as time is contained in every empirical representation of the manifold, end quote. Since Kant emphasizes the formal nature of perception so much here, one can simply read this as an indication that every empirical sensation is perceived at some present time, which has its place in a general formal order of time. And that is also what is meant. But if the formal properties of time were the only thing meant, and the only thing paid attention to the formal properties of each concrete perception, one could connect or separate just about anything, because the purely formal properties of the various moments of time are, by definition, always the same. What distinguishes the very moments in time in the, quote, empirical representative of representation of the manifold, end of quote, that is the basis for synthesis from one another, is not only their respective temporal location in the general series of moments in time, but also the respective content to which they are linked, the specific manifold available to the categories to synthesize. Excuse me. The now is not simply the now that follows the previous one, but this given manifold now here compared to the previous now here or there of this same or another given manifold. The temporal order of simultaneity or succession is an order of specifically given manifolds. The temporal order of, this is at the same time, but that is following something else. So the conception of time as relevant for the schematism includes an irreducibly receptive moment, so much so that if the order is reversible or determinable by the subject, it is disqualified as truly objective. As, for instance, Kant notes that the order in which one views a house can vary. I can start from the top to the bottom. I can go from the bottom to the top. That clearly is not an objective order. That simply is the order of presentation from my subjective perspective. So this is an indication that this series, this is not an indication of this series in objective order, and the fact indicates that the properties of the house one sees are in each case simultaneously part of it as a substance. River that is not reversible and indicates an objectively successive state of affairs. Thirdly, in explaining how temporality functions in the application of the categories, most clearly in the analogies of experience, Kant points to two different senses of time and how the two are related. he distinguishes between what he calls wahrgenommene Zeit, perceived time, and what he calls time itself, or time in general, die Zeit überhaupt. That is, the subjective order of the manifold, the wahrgenommene Zeit, as given to the subject up until now from the objective order of things. Whereas the former includes at the lowest level simply registering the various input of the manifold in a succession of nows, the latter includes not only the given now and some awareness of the past nows. Time in general extends beyond that to a conception of time that has an order that holds always and extends to an intended future that may or may not coincide with what the subject expects based upon the subject's past and present experiences until now. So the further course of experience provides the measure whether the categories have actually achieved their aim of providing us with true knowledge of the objects of experience. And of course, the future course of experience is not something we make, but something we encounter or experience. Returning then to the notion of time as restricting the employment of the categories, this latter point explains why the results of the various syntheses that provide us with experience are always in some sense provisional, that is, subject to future confirmation or disconfirmation of what we took objectively to be an always, but only appeared so based on one's limited subjective experience up to that point. Hence, Kant also speaks of time as a Nötigung, a coercion, as revealing the necessary connections, capturing how things in the world actually are. The section on the schematisms make clear that the subject does not make the world and the objects within it, but rather, based on the subject's experience at each point, strives to correctly capture and recognize the nature of the objects within the world and their causal interactions, and that it can do so more or less accurately, which is why all empirical truths are fallible and subject to revision by future experience. Or I might add, the experience of others, although that is a point that Kant broaches not in the Transcendental Aesthetic, but only much later in the Doctrine of Method, and is so not discussed in Heidegger's book or lectures on Kant. Heidegger endorses and extends each of these major points and adds another equally significant claim that he admits in one sense does violence, is gewaltsam, in taking Kant further than he himself was able to go from Heidegger's perspective, but one that is not only phenomenologically justified, but also consistent with the general direction in which the critique points, even if Kant himself shied away from taking that step. In fact, in the Kant book, this is the most original and extensively developed point in the book, namely that in the end, temporality and imagination are not separate, but rather essentially related phenomena. Consistent with Heidegger's comments about the role that Husserl's phenomenology played in his reading of Kant, we can clarify each of these points by showing how they represent Heidegger's modified appropriation of Husserlian insights. Heidegger's emphasis is on the pure form of temporality as it is implicitly developed in the transcendental deduction of the categories and the section on schematism and the principles. In that regard, his focus is on what he calls the ontological or transcendental truth of the structures of experience that make ontic truth possible. He also refers to this dimension of experience as the horizon for the concrete experience of objects, which, as he noted at the beginning of the talk, he also calls the understanding of being that opens up the possibility for objects to be encountered. He's also very clear that though the kind of imagination he's trying to show is another way of describing temporality as such, is not productive in the sense of making or causing the objects, ontic production. It does not create objects, but rather creates the backdrop against which they can show themselves. And the objects that we encounter that show themselves are not mere fictions or creations of the imagination. A Heidegger quote, "What counts as merely imagined are things that are not actually present at hand. But what is constructed, das Gebildete in the imagination, Einbildungskraft, is by its very essence not something present at hand, since the transcendental imagination can never be ontically creative. What is constructed in it can thus essentially never be mere imagination in the sense just mentioned. Rather, the horizon for objects that is produced through the imagination, the understanding of being, is what makes possible the distinction between ontic truth and ontic semblance, mere imagination, end of the quote. What decides the ontic truth or semblance is not the horizon as such, but concrete empirical evidence against the backdrop of this horizon. Heidegger's own interest in the Kant book is transcendental or ontological truth, of course, but the passage makes clear that Heidegger is also in pains to emphasize that the subject, neither through imagination nor through the syntheses of imagination and understanding, does not create, but rather encounters the object of experience, and intuition, in this case, empirical sense intuitions, serve as the measure for distinguishing ontic truth and ontic semblance. This is consistent with Heidegger's repeated insistence that, quote, intuition represents the proper essence of knowledge, and in spite of all the mutuality of the relationship and intuition, thinking that intuition possesses proper priority, end of quote, and that, quote, finite knowledge is non-creative intuition, so that what we encounter and experience is not mere appearances, but rather the things themselves. Another way of putting it, according to the way Heidegger uses the word and suggests Kant's, is that the subject has the capacity for transcendence, experience and knowing objects other than the subject that are not merely subjective, but genuine objects within the spatio-temporal framework of the world. In the background here, of course, as I mentioned above, is Husserl's sixth logical innovation that Heidegger continued to praise even after he had parted ways with Husserl on other crucial issues. As I mentioned earlier, Husserl there shifts the question from the correspondence between a subjective object as given in experience with the transcendent objects independent of experience to the question of the correspondence between the object as intended and the object as given in the appropriate kinds of fulfilling intuitions that present the object itself in person, leibhaftig. The basis for asserting the existence of an object or the truth of an intention of that object is evidence, and Heidegger is identifying the schematism as the chapter in which temporality is revealed to be the fundamental dimension within which such experiences of evidence, the fulfillment or disappointment of that intention are presented. In this respect, Kant's insights in the schematism chapter come closest to Husserl's Bernal manuscripts on time that explicitly link the intention fulfillment structure of consciousness to temporality as the other fundamental structure of consciousness for Husserl. Since the further course of experience at the ontic level is not something we make, but something we encounter, then it is what not only makes possible, but also restricts the subject in the application of the categories. But how is this related to imagination? This is my last issue. Since, as we've seen, Heidegger stresses that the objects are not mere products of the imagination. What is the proper role played by the imagination in the constitution of experience, and how is this related to temporality? Husserl notes that the A version of the deduction of the categories includes an essential role not just for intuition and understanding, but for imagination as Einbildungskraft as well. In fact, Heidegger claims that Kant himself recognizes, apparently everything that is part of the structure of the syntheses that show themselves in the essential construction of knowledge is brought about by the imagination, quote, going beyond Kant himself. When Kant notes that, quote, synthesis in general is, as we will soon show, the mere workings of the imagination, a blind but irreplaceable function of the soul, without which we would not have any knowledge at all, but one that we are seldom conscious of, end quote. According to Kant's own understanding, the role of the imagination in synthesis is limited to the second of three essential stages described in the A deduction as prerequisite for contributions of intuition as described in the Translaesthetic to yield knowledge. Kant says that, quote, the first thing that must be given to us a priori for the sake of knowledge of every object is the manifold of pure intuition, The synthesis of this manifold through the intuition is the second, but does not yield knowledge. The concepts that give this pure synthetic unit and consist solely in the representation of a necessary synthetic unity yield the third thing contributing to the knowledge of a given object and rely upon the intellect, end quote. Though Kant himself sees the imagination as playing an essential but subordinate role, Heidegger argues that the actual analysis shows that the imagination plays the most basic role as it mediates between intuition and the understanding, even within the confines of the transcendental deduction of the categories. Moreover, in his reading of the Schematism, he will also make the case that the imagination is not only one moment contributing to the categorical synthesis, but that the categorical synthesis itself has genuine content or meaning only through its relationship to imagination in the form of temporality. From Heidegger's perspective, the categories understood independently of their relation to temporality are mere notions, empty formal concepts without concrete meaning. Recalling Kant's own position that, quote, concepts without intuitions are empty, or another one, that without it they lack sense of meaning. The schemata and the connection they establish between these notions and temporality as the pure forms of intuition are what give them meaning. As opposed to Kant, who sees the role of the imagination as limited to the second stage of synthesis that leads to categorical synthesis as knowledge, Heidegger maintains that, quote, the empirical syntheses in intuition, in the imagination, in the concept are all precisely grounded in pure syntheses that are all rooted in the pure synthesis of pure temporally related imagination, end of quote. As he reformulates the points Kant is making in the first two stages of the A deduction, Heidegger summarizes the point of the first stage as establishing the requirement that synthesis requires that the subject be able to discern the manifold against a succession of now moments. In Heidegger's words, quote, only the preceding orientation on the pure succession of the now opens up the horizon in which the successive moments can present themselves as successive, end of the quote. He sees Kant recognizing that we would not have an awareness of a manifold of impressions, quote, if we were limited to an awareness of a now this, and then immediately thrust to another now, so to speak, end of quote. In order for the presented isolated unities become something like a unity of empirical intuition, there needs to be a unifying whereby, quote, each now is already a now no longer, a just having been that was previously and at the same time, end of quote. And as Heidegger adds, quote, in the unity of the now, the horizon is gained in which the manifold can offer itself as such. Hence, the synthesis of a priori apprehension at this first stage already, this is Heidegger again, builds out time as the pure succession of the nows. Remember, this is the bildet in the middle of the Einbildungskraft. As he turns to the second stage, the synthesis of imagination in the mode of reproduction, Heidegger sees Kant as recognizing that consciousness must be able to call up the manifold of now moments that are no longer present as now. This ability to retain and maintain past nows and their manifold, quote, again, Heidegger, makes it possible to offer the connection of the now no longer as such, that is, what has been, Gewesenes. This presentation of the purely having been in the succession of nows is the unity of each of them with the actual now. It is the pure reproductive synthesis in which time is past is immediately presented as itself as past, end of quote. Heidegger describes it as the way each now recedes into the very next now no longer and is about to recede further without being lost. Even the language Heidegger uses indicates that he sees Kant as pointing to Husserl's phenomenological insight into primary memory as retention. This becomes even clearer when Heidegger turns to the synthesis of recognition, the third moment, and characterizes it as a precognition, or what in Husserl's terms would be a protension. Knowledge, or to use Husserl's language, an intention of the object that has been presented in intuition involves not just recalling the manifold that's been presented, but synthesizing it as a unity in itself, one that persists as such, and hence is governed by relationships that hold not only for past subjective experience of it, but hold objectively. And that means always across time and into the future. In the transcendental deduction itself, this last temporal relation is not thematized as such, since Kant is maintaining a strict distinction between intuition and thinking that Heidegger intends to overcome by showing how both intuition and thinking are rooted in imagination, built out, gebildet, as temporality. However, looking forward to what we will learn in the schematism, Heidegger summarizes his overall view of what Kant is pointing to without realizing it is the temporal underpinnings of all synthesis. Quote from Heidegger, the synthesis of apprehension is related to the present, that of, oh, I hope I have that page. Here it is, reproduction to the past, and that of precognition to the future. In as far as all three modes of synthesis are related to time, these moments of time constitute the unity of time itself, and the three syntheses receive the uniform ground of themselves in the unity of time. Last page. With the introduction of the categories as essentially pointing to the future, Heidegger can also explain why the chapter on schematism is so crucial to understanding how objectivity is constituted and how we can distinguish ontic semblance from ontic truth, or the objectivity of our knowledge, in other words. What I have called the further course of experience before now is what Heidegger calls the unified horizon of a priori Widerstand, resistance, of a future in which we do not make our things, but encounter them as they show themselves to us across time as the a priori form of all experience. In applying the categories to what is provided to us at any given point in time until now, our aim must be to apply them not in such a way as we would like things to be, or in the belief that we can make reality as we choose, but rather as it shows themselves in ways that are often contradictory to what we have believed up until now, or how we would like to have them. Quote, transcendental concepts are those that determine an object in general as an object. They constitute objectivity, for which we can now say they contribute to what follows from resistance, Widerständigkeit, to which all unifying is bound. Of course, Gegenstand, Widerständigkeit here. So in this sense, they both make possible the objects, but also must be restricted in their application by the objects themselves as they show themselves to us in the further course of experience, which is where correspondence as a relationship between intention and fulfillment makes sense. As Heidegger puts it, quote, according to their very essence, all categories go back to a free self-obligation that characterizes the subject as such. They are grounded in the anticipatory projectant of a unified horizon of a priori resistance, end of quote. But why call temporality a feature of pure imagination? The answer lies in the ecstatic nature of temporality itself. Even Kant saw that retention involves a kind of synthesis or reproduction of what is now no longer present, and therefore attributed it to the imagination. How much more then is an awareness and anticipation of the future a productive projection? In this regard, for Heidegger, the imagination as Einbildungskraft builds out or produces, bildet, the unified, but in itself different dimensions of the temporal horizon for all experience. This kind of temporality is, of course, not the same as the much richer notion of originary temporality that Heidegger develops in Being and Time, a kind of temporality that has to do above all with the projection of a Wohlem Willen for Dasein as a whole. In his Kant book and his lecture course, Heidegger wants to stress Kant's positive contributions and less the narrowness of his project aimed solely at the subject as knower and objects as present at hand thence. In this sense, we can say that Kant missed the existential dimension of temporality in the fullest sense, and that he provides insights into the constitution of only one region of beings. However, according to Heidegger's reading in the Kant book and the lectures on Kant, his critical work does fit in within Heidegger's broader claim in Being and Time that even region ontologies will be grounded in temporality as the ultimate horizon for any understanding of being and beings. Thank you very much for also your patience.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this wonderful, wonderful conference, really. I think we enjoyed it very much. So, if we have any questions, perdón, si tenemos preguntas, por favor, podemos proceder son 5 para las 8 hasta 10, 15 minutos, Rosemary. O 10 minutos, 15. Son casi las 8 ya.
Hello.
10 minutes, okay.
Hello, Professor. I would like to thank you very much. I hope you could excuse my poor English.
It's much better than my Spanish.
Okay. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the difference between the A and B deduction? I think it's very well known the thesis that Heidegger maintains that in the B deduction, Kant goes back from
Yes.
his revolutionary intuition. And I think there is some passages that could indicate that. For example, one that is quoted in the paper that immediately before the proper transcendental deduction starts or begins, Kant mentioned that synthesis is an act of the imagination, while in the B deduction, and I think in the first paragraph, yes, Kant mentioned that this is an act of the understanding.
Right.
And later on, he will differentiate between figurative synthesis that is product of imagination and an intellectual synthesis that is product of the understanding. So
Okay.
how do you think is the relationship between both deductions and how the content of both affect the schematism?
Heidegger gives two explanations. Oh, he gives one explanation, and I'll give another. But he implicitly is referring to the other one. The simple one is, he says, Kant simply backs off. He just remains too closely tied to a traditional notion of logic. And as he starts to deviate from that, finds himself worried. He also addresses, though, the other one that I think was actually the most basic. Between the A deduction and the B deduction, Kant is seeing how he's being read. So if you think about what Kant added, one of the largest sections that he added was the refutation of transcendental idealism, right? What happens is Kant is being read as a sort of an empirical idealist, as if objects are only in our head, right? And so he's saying this looks like it's a psychological explanation. And so all we ever get is almost like Descartes, ideas. So that's an accusation. And this sort of empirical idealism, it worries him a lot. And it actually gets picked up after Kant very clearly in Fries and everybody after that make it in. And we still have some modern psychology doing all that. So he gets very worried about this being psychological, strictly subjective. And that's why Heidegger also emphasizes that psychology is an empirical matter about the way humans think. And he says Kant should have never backed off. What he's identifying is necessary conditions for knowledge, and that is not mere psychology. So he thinks he's just shying away, A, because he relates too strongly on the notion of logic, and B, because he's worried about a misinterpretation of what he's doing.
Okay, thank you very much. Just
Sure.
a following question. So would you agree that there is a difference in content between both deduction, or is just a difference in presentation?
I think that he actually has insights in the A deduction that he covers over in the B deduction. I don't think in the B deduction he's saying anything was wrong. He just says, I'm not going there because I know how this has been understood. And so at that point, the Einbildungskraft doesn't get taken out. It just gets moved into the subsequent chapter.
Thank you.
If he was really changing, he would have had to change the whole schematism, but he didn't.
Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Mariana, por favor.
Muchas gracias por la conferencia. Estamos muy contentos de tenerlo acá.
Thank you so much for
Este,
coming.
Sure.
Okay.
Perdón por el...
If I don't follow that.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Quería preguntar si nos puede explicar el concepto de Widerstand. Ich habe nicht gut verstanden. No entendí bien el concepto de Widerstand, de resistencia a priori.
Widerstand. Yes.
Es la experiencia de lo real, al modo de Scheller, etc.
So Heidegger is going to make a lot of this in other places, but he's talking about what he says is very Heideggerian. In the very etymology, we can find things. He says objects are objecta, right? They're the objecta. They're the other of what we make. So it's the objecta, and he's going to train that into the Gegenstand, right? And the Gegen is not just simply spatial. The Gegen is now, he's building on that which we do not control, that which we only encounter and which shows itself. And intuition is the course in which it shows itself. And since at any point we're intending more than we have up until now, what is going to come may be something that is not what I wish, not what I expect, right? And so in that sense, it is the Widerstand, that which I do not control.
Uh-huh.
And by the way, Hegel picks that up.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm not very much acquainted with Kant and the problem of metaphysics. I have not seen the lectures on Kant. Heidegger gave around the time that he published Being and Time, I think a year later or something.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
So this has been very interesting. It's a very dense paper also, and there in Being and Time, Heidegger finally says that this meaning, the meaning of the being of Dasein is temporality, finally. No? It's a basic thing. And what he's trying to do in Being and Time, as I believe, it's my understanding, you're the expert here, he wanted from this temporality, this meaning of the being of Dasein, his project was to arrive to the
Right.
meaning of being in general, no? And he doesn't do it because he cannot, from the being, from the meaning of the being of Dasein, which is temporality, to arrive to the meaning of being in general. That I believe that what he wanted to do, but you can tell me, was to put an equivalence between being and time, because
Right.
Being manifests itself always in the horizon of time. And time is not temporality because it's beyond, it belongs to being. It's not subjective. It's not inside
Right.
the temporality of Dasein.
Okay.
And-
Can I?
but in Kant, yes, you have just mentioned this part of the refutation of idealism. He wanted to prove that he believed in an outside world, Kant, no? And of course, Kant sees the problem within time. Time is almost everywhere. It's and there's another thing that confuses me. I don't know if it's clear, but for me it's confusing. Precisely when he's talking in the analogies of experience, and made the example, the river. I mean, it's not within me.
No,
There's
that's
an
right.
objective movement of the boat in the river, okay? And the order in which I go up and down the river or go around the house is my order. And I don't know if
Let me try the
for
first.
Kant, it's in
Okay.
subjectivity, no?
All right, let me try the first and then I'll come back. It was way too brief at the end. But when Heidegger is trying to show, in my view, he has a very limited goal in being in time. And what he's trying to show, and his claim is that time is the horizon against which any understanding of being takes place, right? And what he's trying to trace back to is what he calls originary temporality. You could not use Kant to get there. You cannot find that through Vorhandenheit. So in a sense, there's a reason he does not start with scientific objects or even Dinge. He starts with equipment, because if you use equipment, then you come back to ends, right? I use them for something, which takes us back to fundamental priorities and what I want for my life as a whole, which he calls looking at that futurity. That's originary temporality, okay? Says, now, that was all I needed to show you. And then he sort of says, well, we got communally, finished that off. But he does say, for all of the regions, at bottom, the claim was there, from this notion, we can have much limited kinds of an understanding of particular beings with their own kind of temporality. So there, if I'm going to do an ontology of mathematical objects, I'm going to show how they have an atemporal temporality. For these, he's trying to show how they have an experiential temporality that is very narrow, because it has nothing to do with evaluative predicates. It has nothing to do with priorities, and so is not a way that we can at the end see. Now, in the paper we heard just earlier this afternoon, we heard how Kant is saying, or he later comes in and said, what happened that we lost temporality? Then we come to think all we have is objects and everything else is not real. But the positive thing is, he says, look, I can show you that for objects, they have their own temporal basis as a region. I could do it for God. I could do it for other things, right? I just did it with use objects in being in time. And so it's consistent with that. But the limited part is, by looking only at nature, we have already restricted a genuine access to originary temporality, and we've restricted all sorts of, as we claim that's all there is, we lost the access to all kinds of other regions, which is what we heard in the paper two before mine, about his critique of Kant and modern science and the notion of everything just being an object.
Thank you. Una última pregunta, Fernando. The last question.
Sure.
What about space?
Thank you very much, Professor Nenon, for your wonderful conference. I apologize because my English is very improvised. So, Kant is an indisputable source of Heidegger, of course, but don't you think, in addition with Kant, if it would be possible to understand the ecstatic condition of temporality as a reinterpretation of Book 11 of the St. Augustine Confessions. Don't you think it is possible, would be possible?
I think I would leave that question to an expert.
To yourself, I think.
And I am not, certainly not on Augustine. But I think that what Heidegger, consistent with Heidegger's overall view, and I think the direction of Kant, is to not take things from the God's eye view. From the divine perspective, all of time already is there and is all at once. And I think that's clearly not what time as presented in Kant is. And I think that Heidegger is also, that's why both Kant is stressing finitude and Heidegger is stressing finitude precisely as not this Nunstanz all at once from the divine perspective. He's now asking, how is it that time is there and constitutes the very finitude of finite knowers? And we didn't get into that here, but even finite agents.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Le preguntaba al profesor qué pasa con el espacio, porque en Kant es tiempo y espacio, ¿no es cierto? Y me dice que tiene un libro sobre el tema, o sea que lo tendremos otra vez con nosotros to talk about space the next time, not only about time. Muchísimas gracias por tu atención. Thank you so much for your presence here. It has been really a pleasure. Muchas gracias.